In my opinion, Guild Wars 2 has a huge balancing problem. I'm Surma, and let me elaborate this further. So let me start by saying the current state of Guild Wars 2 is that we have 27 elite specs, and we got in the latest 2 expansions, we got new weapons, being the spear and, let's say, the old weapons that existed previously but were, let's say, expanded to new elites or new classes. Furthermore, there are a lot of relics and, of course, a lot of different stats, at least in World vs. World and PvE. We have 3 different game modes, like World vs. World, PvE, and PvP. Of course, there are many more niche game modes like GVG or even Push nowadays. And of course, in PvE, there are more different, open world styles. There are instance content like fractals or raids and strikes. So everything is a little bit different. So you have to cater to a lot of different kind of people, different kind of, goals of the builds that, let's say, they should achieve. So it's really hard. You have such a broad spectrum of stuff to cater to. So that's the current state. And I also want to say that I'm quite experienced in PvE and PvP. I play a lot of World vs. World roaming and stuff. I play some Zerg play, but I don't play any GVG. So I will focus for now on, let's say, the PvE and PvP meta and how the balancing is there. I will shortly go into the World vs. World stuff as far as I know, as I experience it as a roamer or as a, let's say, cloud player, but I won't go into detail of the Zerg play because that's not my expertise. So the good things currently are that we have really frequent balance patches. I would say the frequency is not as bad as it used to be. So we have every 3 months a somewhat major balance patch. The question is the balance patch really as major as they seem to be? I would say in most cases not, but we get to that later. And I would say it's really good to have frequent balance patches, and that's a thing they currently try to achieve. And we had times where we didn't get a balance patch in a year, and that was horrible. And now it's at least only 3 months we have to wait, which is good enough. It could be better, but it's good enough. And I have to mention that there are hotfixes in between. I call them hotfixes because sometimes some builds are really out of, let's say, are completely broken. For example, we had the Herald Spear, or the Revenant Spear after Shanti Wild's release was incredibly strong. On Herald, on Renegade, it was really broken. And in PvE that is. And now they fixed it before their regular balance patch, just so that it's more in line. I think that's totally fine and it's totally, let's say, reasonable to do that. And I think actually they should do that more often. It doesn't have to be a major patch where every class gets something. It's better to have a, let's say, a short, really small balance patch that addresses issues that make the game worse to some extent. It's debatable, of course, if a PvE build that is performing really, really strong, if that makes the game worse or not, that's another question. I would say it does make the game worse, but not everyone agrees on that. And of course, builds like the Spear Warrior in PvP are completely broken. Even after the hotfix, they are still the best build, and you see that the hotfix did not go as far as it had to be. And therefore, I would say more hotfixes are the least you should do. And regarding the general direction of, for example, PvE balancing, it seems like that every expansion, let's say the general damage numbers go up by quite a lot. And if you told someone that played at a high level in, let's say, Heart of Thorns release, that the damage numbers are, let's say, over 40k at least for the most builds that you play in current PvE right now, they would thought you're crazy, because the raid bosses are still the same, and you see how, let's say, easy it is to burst them into the next phase now, because we have so much more damage, and I think that's not a good direction to go into. Either they should, let's say, increase the health of the raid bosses and strike bosses, for example, or they should decrease the damage classes do right now. Of course, that's a really tough choice, and it's a hot take to do that, because if they really did that, a lot of people would not be able to clear stuff now, especially with the really difficult stuff like Zeros or Harvest Temple CM. So, Legendary mode it is. And it's really crazy how they can, let's say, get that back in somewhat nice areas where there's not too much damage, and the old content is somewhat challenging because right now it's not. And in PvP, I feel like a lot of balancing is revolving around just making outliers somewhat normal again. And I think that's what balance is, yes, but I feel like that's not the most exciting thing. And the direction they have here is really just make it okay to play. Nothing is too broken, and therefore, let's say, makes it really unfun to play. But I feel like that's also not the best way to balance. So now let me come to a bit of my, let's say, things I would criticize about the balance right now. For example, they now address the issue that Celestial is completely broken in World vs. World, not only in roaming, but also in Circle Day, because World vs. World has received some rather big nerfs to cleansing builds, for example, and therefore a lot of condition contribution is now in. I think that was quite a bit of shake-up when that came first through, and I think that's nice, some shake-up. The question is, Celestial is way too strong. That is totally fine to nerf it, but the question is, will it change if people don't run Celestial anymore? What will it be then? What is the change there? I think the change in general is good, but the question is if it's the right change to just remove something because they can't keep it balanced. Let's see how that goes. I think the roaming meta is changing quite a lot, because I would say every strong roaming build was Celestial. That is just fact. I feel like you maybe can run Celestial on something like a Catalyst after the nerf, but Harbinger as the best roaming build right now, in my opinion, is definitely not playable as with Celestial anymore. Or let's say you can play it, but it's way worse and therefore will not be fighting 1vx easily. And I would say the general direction of, for example, this change is good. The question is, can you keep up with this? And I fear they cannot. Let me now get to why I think this is. So I feel like that a lot of changes in the balance patch notes, for example in the preview, but also in the old balance patches, are non-changes. What does that mean? I mean by that every class gets something. Some number changes, some cooldown changes, a little bit more healing, a little bit more power damage, a little bit less damage, just to, let's say, bring outliers, like I said, back into the normal. But it's no shakeups at all. So it doesn't change anything, to be honest. A lot of builds are really good before, and after the change they are still really good. It doesn't change that much that you say, okay, I can't play Spear anymore on Warrior. And that's a bad thing, I think. Balance patch should not only be something that brings outliers back, but it should be something that makes people log back into the game to say, holy shit, I want to test something new. I want to try this because it seems like it's really good right now. And it's not a bad thing to have something that was played before by everyone to not be played at all anymore, or not that much. I think that's a good thing. That might be a hot take, but I feel like you should swap from Berserker maybe as a side noder to maybe something like a Weaver. And then a few, let's say, weeks or months later, we get another big balance patch and something changes again. I think in PvP, that's what's keeping the, let's say, players alive and the population alive. And not some really small changes that don't shake up anything. So Spellbreaker was good for, let's say, before Spear. Now you have Spear Obviously, that's way more, let's say, powerful, but it's still the Spellbreaker build. It did not change anything by that, for that matter. And we had that for ages. For example, Catalyst was really strong. Now it's not that good anymore, but still, how long it takes something to change is not good. For example, ever since the release of Rival, Chronomancer, is really, really good. And it's actually, there's no contender. Maybe even Tempest after the buffs now, but still. And I think that's not good. There should be some shakeups. There should be really big changes that, let's say, decrease the play rates and increase play rates of really low played elite specs or builds. And I think that's what a balance patch should do. For PvE, I think you should not do that too often, because a lot of people grind to some extent for their gear, and then maybe the gear changes. I think that's not a good thing. It's more like you should, for example, if the so-called flavor of the month is something like a Spear Revenant, and it should still be playable after the patch, and people are not wasting their time to get some gear. It should be more like, it's really good, it's the best performing, and next patch maybe it's Thief or something. And then the patch after that, maybe it's Mesmer or something. I think that's how it should be. And it should not be the build is changing really drastically. At least in PvE, that's my opinion. And they should all be tuned down a bit from the damage perspective, I feel like. But I also think that in World vs. World, it's really hard to make big changes without making the, let's say, the whole World vs. World structure new. And therefore, I won't talk about World vs. World changes so much. I talk more about PvP changes, for example, because I feel like PvP changes, they can be really easily tuned. So if something is way over-tuned after you, let's say, buffed it, you just decrease it a little bit. You hotfix in between. That's how it should be. So now, let me also touch a bit on the stats and relics, because I feel like they keep adding relics, and I think that's a really good thing. But let me talk about why I feel like it's a bit sad that they add relics, and most of the time they don't tune them. Which is sad, because a lot of relics have a nice idea, but are way too bad, because some relics are so strong. For example, ever since the release of the Rivers relic in PvP, almost every build uses, at least can use, Relic of Rivers to some extent, and because it's so good. And if they don't tune it to an, let's say, nice level, it will always stay that strong, and the relics they release after that have either be stronger than that, or you don't play them, which is really sad, because I think you should pick a relic like the Reaper relic on a build that fits it, and not just because the relic is so strong you pick it on every build. That's not how it should be played, in my opinion. And I also feel like that let's stay with PvP here. I also feel like that the stats in PvP are, you run Berserker or Carrion or Avatar. That's currently what is, let's say, played. Some build can run Sage, but to be honest, they are more like niche builds. And I feel like that's sad. Previously we had so many different stats, and they slowly decreased the stats because they couldn't balance it. And I feel like that's really decreasing the build crafting you can. And that also comes into the next, let's say, issue, I feel like, because currently I feel in PvP, if you don't have evade frames and invulnerability framing, chaining like Warrior does, it's just a burst meta. You just burst someone in a few seconds. And that's really hard for new people to learn. And I think that's an issue. I feel like to get more people into playing PvP, it has to be a slower meta. I feel also that a slower meta can develop different kind of builds, tank builds. Bunker Chrono we don't want back. But if you have some nice side note builds, you have some teamfight builds, you have some roamers, but nothing dies in a second. There is some, let's say, continuous decline of health until the player loses or wins. It should not be something that is over in quarter of a second or something because you get backstep for 10k or something and you die. That's not how it should be, I feel like. And I think touching relics and stats is a big thing here to do. And that's also another criticism that I have, that they mostly change weapons, which is fine to adjust weapons because that's where a lot of skills deal their damage or let's say get their value from, or their classes and builds. But I feel like that's not the whole issue. You should always try to not focus on one thing that's overperforming. For example, Spear Warrior. Yes, the Spear is the reason why it's really good. But you should not only nerf Spear, which they did not do that much. They should also look at Spellbreaker, for example. Why does the full counter have a way too low cooldown? Or why can you evade so often because you have so many endurance gains, when you, for example, if you play strength or something. And therefore, I should also mention that they should look at traits and weapons in conjunction. And for example, Elementalist has really big problems from the traits perspective. The weapons are actually not that bad. Of course, Spear is not as good as it could be, but at least in PvP. But the big issue here are the traits. The Fire trait line, for example, is really strong. It gives you damage and condition cleanse. Arcane is okay to some extent. But if you look at Air, it's so bad in competitive modes. You get almost nothing from the trait line except Lightning Rod. And you would never take it. And that's a bad thing. I think you should always, let's say a little bit more like Mesmer, for example. You have 5 trait lines, core trait lines that is, and every single trait line delivers some value. Mesmer is another problem because Chaos and Inspiration are really tanky, and the other 3 trait lines are the more aggressive ones. And that's why you often see builds that take both tanky trait lines and an elite spec, or 2 offensive one in an elite spec, and that leads to really squishy or really tanky builds. There is no in between, because if you go for 1 offensive and 1 defensive, you don't get anything good out of that, and then you just lose. So I feel like the balancing should be more like every trait line delivers something for one situation, and if that situation occurs, you're a really good build. But if the situation doesn't occur, then your build is not that good, and you should rather run a different trait. And I think that's how it should be, and not always be like Elementalist. If you don't run Fire, you don't deal any damage. And that's a bad thing. And a lot of classes actually have that. I think every trait line should have one situation where it's good, and not in general, you have to deal damage, you have to deal damage by using this trait line, which is not a good thing. It should be more like, in this situation, this trait line does damage. In this situation, the other trait line is better for dealing damage. That's at least my opinion on that. And like I said, a lot of classes have that issue. And for example, Revenant is a rather, let's say, good, let's say every, trait line can be run, but I feel like you have so much healing power, or let's say defense in the Salvation trait line, that this trait line is also really easy to bunker trait line. And I think you should be really careful that bunker does not mean healing in the same sense. For example, a healing ref should be viable, but a bunker ref should not be viable. That's why they should try to, let's say, change the traits so that you have healing and salvation and not bunker and damage reduction. But that's just my opinion. And also, I feel like they don't do any reworks anymore. I think in the last few months, years even, they did not really do reworks. And before that, it was really nice. They did rework to Berserker, or even Renegade. That was the last one. But this rework was rather small. And I feel like that's what really shines if you get a real rework of a underused elite spec, for example. That's what they should do. I think they have a lot of workload with the new spears, for example, or the new weapons, and therefore they can't fit that in their schedule anymore, but I feel like that would deliver much more to balance patches. And I also think a lot of traits need reworks, because, for example, traits like the Scepter trait on Necromancer that changes the skill is a really cool idea, and I think that would be way better to implement on more classes, on more, let's say, trade lines, and therefore you want to take a trade line that maybe is a little bit more aggressive on a bunker build because you want the skill change. You really want it. And that's really, that would be something really cool in my opinion. And I feel like, for example, Weaver is just getting some small changes in the next patch, but it will not see any more play than it currently has, because the issues still persist because they did not go far enough. And that's why we get to my suggestion solutions now, that I feel like you should make more balanced patches, but they should stay frequent and have way more impact than they currently have. Non-changes should be not in there. It should be really big changes. For example, give Weaver stability on a trade in there, so that you can go against a Catalyst, because Catalyst is just straight up better in most circumstances. And therefore buff Weaver really hard, and that's the flavor of the month for the next balance patch. That only works if the balance patches are really frequent. So every 1 month, every maybe even every 2 weeks, small changes that impact the game. Not that many, like you have to do 100 changes. Just do maybe 20 that impact the let's say the builds played. I think that's really important. And I think the flavor of the month should be mostly PvP focused. World versus World should be really, let's say, slow changes, because that affects way more than just one build. And in PvE, I feel like it's more like you change numbers. What is really good right now? It should not be change a complete build by, let's say, giving, I would say, Chronomancer 10% more crit chance baseline, because then you have to adjust your builds, and that's not really nice. I think you should more adjust damage numbers. For example, give a trade in Chronomancer not 5% more damage, maybe 50% or something like that. And then decrease and change that every few months. And I think that is really nice. As well as doing more reworks, like I said, trades or even elite spec reworks. I think that's really nice. And I think what also would be a really nice thing to do, what they really, let's say, rarely do, is rebalancing the positions of trades in their trade lines. So not only change one trade from being, let's say, the minor to a grandmaster or something, but also the adept to a grandmaster, for example, but also repositioning it. For example, not being in curses in the necromancer trade line, but maybe being in soul reaping, to change the build completely just by moving a trade, because it fits in there more, let's say, from the build crafting perspective. I feel like that could be really nice to buff underperforming trade lines. Just move trades, not completely rework them. I feel like that's a nice middle ground. And I also feel like there should be more available and viable stats in PvP, at least. In PvE, it makes sense always that you crit cap in a power build and do as much power and ferocity as you can. In a condition damage build, of course, you want condition damage and expertise. I mean, that makes sense. That is hard to change. But in PvP, I feel like you can make some nice builds, because only running Berserker all the time is quite boring and leads to a burst meta. And I think that's not what it should be. It should be something like, if you invest in tanky stats, you survive a bit longer and therefore maybe counter something that wants to burst you, and not going 5 evade frames like the current Spear Warrior and going still full Berserker or Heretic, because you feel like that's the only way you can go, because otherwise you don't deal any damage. That's a sad part. And therefore I really advocate for more available stats in PvP at least. And going a bit away from the burst meta, not to a bunker meta of course, but something a little slower, that we can enjoy more new players that want to learn it and are not frustrated by being bursted in a second. And that's only possible if the meta is slower and they can see and learn what they have to dodge and not are completely overwhelmed by the damage they get. But that's enough yapping from me. So if you have any opinion on this, please let me know in the comments. I'm really excited to see how you feel about this. And if you enjoy my discussion here, or my monologue, please leave a like if you want to see more content like this. Don't forget to subscribe. And thanks a lot for watching. I hope to see you in the next video.